Here's a number worth sitting with for a second. For decades, Canada sent nearly all of its natural gas exports south, straight into American pipelines, with no meaningful alternative. No LNG terminal, no ship to Asia, no European contract. The United States was, for all practical purposes, the only buyer, and Washington knew exactly how much leverage that gave it. That arrangement just ended, not with a headline confrontation, but with a signature in a boardroom in Dusseldorf. On July 29, 2026, Uniper, one of Europe's largest energy companies, signed a binding 20-year agreement to purchase 2 million tons of liquefied natural gas annually from Canada's KSI Leesoms project on the northern coast of British Columbia, with first deliveries expected to begin in 2032. The signing took place with Germany's Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Energy, Katharina Reiche, and Canada's ambassador to Germany present in the room. This was not a quiet side deal nobody noticed. It was a formal ceremonial agreement publicly announced by both governments, and it marks the first major long-term LNG supply arrangement ever signed between Canada and Germany. To understand why Germany signed so eagerly and why Uniper specifically, you have to go back to February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe's entire energy architecture came apart almost overnight. Germany had built a huge share of its natural gas supply around Russian pipelines, and Uniper was Germany's largest gas importer, deeply exposed to that Russian supply chain. When Russian gas flows were disrupted, Uniper's losses mounted so severely that the German government was forced to step in with a massive nationalization and bailout to keep the company from collapsing entirely, one of the most dramatic corporate rescues in modern German history. Uniper has been in the process of privatizing again since, but the scar from 2022 never really faded. That is the company that just signed a 20-year binding contract with Canada. Germany was not simply shopping for a vendor. Germany was looking for a supplier it could trust not to weaponize energy for political leverage ever again. Canada offered something almost no other country could match at this scale. The KSI Leesoms project sits on Nisga'a Nation territory on British Columbia's northern coast, a floating LNG production facility designed to be powered largely by British Columbia's hydroelectric grid, positioning it as one of the lowest emissions LNG operations in the world. Uniper's own chief executive, Michael Lewis, said Canada, as a trusted partner, helps diversify Europe's energy supply and strengthens resilience against future disruptions. That is corporate language for something much simpler. Underneath it, Germany got burned once by depending on a single, geopolitically unreliable supplier, and it is not interested in repeating that mistake with anyone else, no matter how good the price looks. Uniper was not the first European buyer to show up at Canada's door. Back in May 2026, Germany's SEFE, the former Gazprom subsidiary that Berlin nationalized and renamed after Russia abandoned its European energy assets, signed the very first KSI Leesoms offtake deal, agreeing to buy roughly 1 million tons of Canadian LNG annually. Then, 2 months later, Uniper came in with its own 20-year, 2 million ton agreement, more than doubling the German commitment on top of what SEFE had already locked in. Total Energies out of France had separately signed its own 20-year agreement to purchase 2 million tons annually from the same project, contingent on a final investment decision, and took a 5% equity stake in Western LNG, the company developing KSI Leesoms. Shell has also been involved in the broader Canadian LNG build-out through earlier agreements. Put together, buyers from Germany, France, Britain, Sweden, and the Netherlands are now lined up for supply from a single Canadian LNG project on the Pacific coast. The numbers are worth laying out plainly because they show what is actually shifting here. KSI Leesoms is projected to have total capacity of up to 12 million tons of LNG annually once fully operational, and a meaningful share of that capacity is already spoken for through these signed agreements. The project's estimated capital cost has been updated to around $30 billion, separate from the additional pipeline infrastructure needed to feed it, and the Canadian federal government has said the project could contribute more than $15 billion to Canada's GDP over its lifetime, with the potential to represent a meaningful share of Canada's total natural gas exports by the middle of the next decade. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is real infrastructure, real capital, and real long-term contracts. It is also worth being honest about the other side of this story because a complete picture requires it. This deal has real critics inside Canada and Germany both. Climate advocates have called the agreement a step backwards, arguing that committing to a massive new fossil fuel project while wildfires and heat waves intensify across both countries sends exactly the wrong signal at exactly the wrong time. There are also Indigenous voices on both sides of this project, some in support through the Nisga'a Nation's direct partnership and ownership stake, others among neighboring communities raising concerns about emissions and ecological impact. And there is a genuine commercial question hanging over all of this too. Some energy analysts have pointed out that Canadian LNG shipped from British Columbia may never physically sail all the way to European ports in the literal sense because of geography, shipping economics, and the lack of Atlantic coast export infrastructure on Canada's side. Instead, some of this gas may move through cargo swap arrangements, with Canadian LNG heading to closer Asian buyers while Europe receives equivalent volumes from suppliers nearer to it. That does not make the contracts meaningless. The money and the long-term supply security commitments are real either way, but it is a detail that complicates the simple version of this story, where a tanker literally sails from British Columbia to Germany. Now, here is where the political backdrop matters, because none of this happened in isolation from what was going on between Ottawa and Washington at the exact same time. Since taking office in March 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney has made trade diversification away from the United States the central pillar of his economic strategy. He has traveled to multiple capitals, building relationships, reached an agreement with China, involving reduced tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for improved access for Canadian agricultural products, and fast-tracked LNG project approvals through a new federal major projects office. Carney has publicly stated a goal of significantly increasing the share of Canadian natural gas exports that go to non-U.S. markets over the coming decade, and framed the broader strategy as a matter of economic sovereignty rather than simple commercial diversification. That strategy was unfolding at the same time Washington was escalating its own trade pressure on Canada. Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods began in February 2025, 25% on most imports with a reduced rate carved out for energy, and by this past summer had escalated to 50% tariffs on a package of Canadian goods worth roughly $20 billion. Carney responded by suspending trade negotiations and announcing dollar-for-dollar retaliation. But underneath that very public, very loud tariff fight, this quieter, structural energy diversification had been building for over a year, culminating in a signed 20-year, multi-billion-dollar commitment with one of Europe's largest utilities, closed in the middle of the same summer that tariff tensions were peaking. Here is what makes contracts like this strategically different from a tariff fight. A tariff can be imposed by executive order and reversed the same way with a social media post or policy reversal the following month. A 20-year binding sale and purchase agreement between a sovereign-backed European utility and a Canadian LNG project is a different category of commitment entirely. Uniper is now contractually locked in through 2052 or later. CFE and Total Energies are locked into their own long-term agreements as well. These are companies with governments behind them, facing their own deep structural need for reliable, non-Russian energy supply. That kind of contract does not get renegotiated by a tariff threat, because the parties on the other side of it have their own national interests driving them to honor it regardless of what happens in Washington. Look at this from the American side of the equation for a moment, because it puts the stakes in context. The United States has for years relied on Canada for the overwhelming majority of its natural gas imports, a significant share of its crude oil imports, and a meaningful portion of the electricity it imports across its grid. Every tariff aimed at Canadian goods lands on a country that is simultaneously deeply embedded in America's own energy supply chain. And while that dynamic has not changed overnight, what has changed is that Canada is no longer entirely dependent on the American market as its only outlet. Every LNG contract signed with a European or Asian buyer reduces, gradually, the degree to which Canadian energy exports rely entirely on American demand and American goodwill. It does not eliminate the relationship. The United States remains an enormous customer for Canadian energy and will for the foreseeable future. But the exclusivity, the total dependence that gave Washington maximum leverage in any negotiation, is being diluted deal by deal. This is not the first time Canada tried to build this kind of relationship with Germany. And that history is worth knowing because it shows how much has actually changed. Back in 2022, when Germany's then-Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited Canada, specifically hoping to secure Canadian LNG as an alternative to Russian gas, he left largely empty-handed. At the time, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau openly told reporters there had never been a strong business case for Canadian LNG exports to Europe, and steered Scholz instead toward a hydrogen project that was years from producing anything. Germany, frustrated, turned instead to Qatar and signed a 15-year LNG supply agreement there. That was the missed opportunity commentators pointed to for years afterward as a strategic misread by Ottawa. What is happening now with Kaysai Leesoms and Uniper is, in a real sense, Canada finally closing the door that was left open back then, except this time it is not a hydrogen project years from reality. It is an LNG facility with signed offtake agreements from multiple European buyers and a real path to construction. It is also worth noting that this is happening alongside Canada's broader push into Pacific energy exports more generally. LNG Canada, a separate, already operating facility in Kitimat, British Columbia, has been exporting to Asian markets, and Canada's first commercial LNG cargo shipped out in mid-2025, heading to South Korea, a symbolic first for a country that had never before exported LNG independently of American pipelines. The expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline, which opened in 2024, has similarly redirected a large share of New Pacific crude exports toward Asia, rather than exclusively toward the United States. None of these individual projects, on their own, fundamentally reshapes Canada's overall energy relationship with America overnight. But taken together, layered one on top of another over several years, they represent a real, measurable shift in the direction Canadian energy is flowing, away from total dependence on a single customer and toward a genuinely diversified set of international buyers. None of this guarantees how the story ends. The Kaysay Leesoms project itself has not yet reached a final investment decision, meaning construction has not formally begun, and first deliveries under the Uniper agreement are not expected until 2032, 6 years from now. A lot can happen between a signed sale and purchase agreement and gas actually flowing onto a ship. Regulatory timelines, financing conditions, environmental opposition, and shifting political winds in both Canada and Germany could all still affect how and whether this plays out exactly as currently planned. And the climate criticism aimed at this project is not going away. It will likely intensify as construction, if it happens, moves forward. But what is already true, verified, and signed is this. Germany's largest energy importer, a company that was nearly destroyed by overdependence on a single unreliable supplier in 2022, chose Canada as the partner it is willing to commit to for the next 20 years. That decision was made publicly, with government officials from both countries in the room, at almost the exact same moment that Washington and Ottawa were locked in an escalating tariff dispute over dairy, alcohol, and automotive trade. The tariff fight generated the headlines. The LNG contract generated something that will likely matter far longer: a structural binding shift in where Canadian energy is committed to flow for the next 2 decades, regardless of what happens in the next election cycle in either country. Carney summed up the underlying philosophy plainly when he talked about Canada's broader energy strategy. Mastering Canadian energy, in his framing, is mastering Canadian economic independence. Whether that framing holds up as fully as Ottawa hopes depends on execution over the coming years, on whether Kaysay Leesoms actually reaches final investment decision, on whether the broader diversification push meaningfully changes Canada's overall trade exposure to the United States, and on whether European demand for Canadian LNG remains as strong in 2032 as it is today. What is not in question is that a real, binding, 20-year commitment now exists between one of Europe's largest energy companies and a Canadian LNG project that did not exist in any operational sense just a few years ago. That is a genuinely significant shift in North American and transatlantic energy relationships, whatever headline eventually gets written about how the broader trade dispute between Canada and the United States is resolved.